For our sermon message this morning will be given by Mr. Tom Bullerosky.
Thank you, Mr. Hall. Unfortunately, none of you in the room knew my mother. Well, of course, except Tracy, but she was probably the kindest woman I think I've ever met. And you know, she was also very spiritually strong. I mean, I'm expecting to see her in the first resurrection. But when I was about 12 or 13 years old, on the way home from the Feast of Tabernacles, my mom came down with diabetes. Now that was the beginning of a very stressful time for my dad in particular and the whole family. Because you know, many people are very familiar with diabetes, but diabetes is can be very debilitating. And as my dad once put it, he never knew what he was going to get when he came home. My mom went through, she worked hard to try to keep her blood sugar stable, but you never knew. Sometimes she came into, she would go through diabetic reactions and she would act like she was drunk or lose her car. Then she was times I've been around when my mom went through a diabetic coma. And that was very scary. And then there was every other year or so. It was also very scary during flu season. Flu season put my mom in intensive care. Almost like clockwork. Every other year she got the flu. So I mean, with this COVID thing, I mean, my mom would have been, she would have been, without God's protection, she would have been dead. But, unfortunately, like we all are going to do, my mom died in 2005. In fact, it was just under 2 months to the day after Ethan was born. Now, not too long ago, back in the March-April time frame, I started suffering a trial that is probably one of the more difficult ones that I've ever had to deal with. And during this whole trial, during the beginnings of this trial, I went through a very, very similar thing to what my dad went through. I mean, God, why? What are you doing here, God? I just don't get it. My brain was racing. It was a whirl. Was I depressed? Yeah, I was depressed. I would go there. Was I angry? Yes, I actually got angry, just like my father. I mean, my emotions were all over the place. And did I sleep? No, I did not. My brain was moving 1,000 miles an hour with thought, all kinds of thought. But you know what changed it for me? I came to the realization that God knew what he was doing. And once that day that I came to the realization that God, and by the way, this wasn't just bringing for me, I was actually reading through the book of Psalms, and then God used the book of Psalms for me to go ahead and come to the realization that, yes, God knows exactly what he's doing. And from that moment on, has the trial gone away? No. But do I have peace? The answer is, yes, I do. Am I still concerned? Yes. But do I lose sleep over it? No. Am I depressed, angry, mad, all the other gamut? No. So today, what I'd like to do is, I'm not going to say anything profound or anything special necessarily, but today all I really like to do is share with you a couple of the lessons of faith that I learned from that experience. Oh yeah, and a back away. And by the way, just as a side note, it wasn't COVID. For me, I was never concerned about COVID. A lot of people were, but an interesting thing is, God is perfect at tailoring every trial just for you. And he tailored this trial just for me. So anyway, on that note, let's go back, and I'd just like to share with you a couple of lessons of faith, personal lessons of faith that I've learned over the last couple months. Now, the first lesson is let God worry about what's happening around the corner. That is not my job to worry about it. Now, if anybody knows me really well, or at least knows me at home, I'm the kind of guy, I love to have a plan for everything. I kind of look out in the distance and say, well, you know, we could have a plumbing problem, so we're going to have to save money for that. Or the car could break down, we have to save money for that. And you know what? I have a plan for the plan. So I usually have a plan A, and then I have a plan B. And then sometimes I'll even, and Tracy will tell you, sometimes I even have a plan C, and it's exhausting for her. And it's actually exhausting for me to have all these plans. But what I learned was, forget the plan. It's not my job to have the plan. It is God's job to develop the plan. Because I can't see around the corner. Who can? God can. Now, I can't talk about faith and lessons and anxiety unless we go to Matthew 5. So let's start by going to Matthew 5. Oh, actually, you know what? I miswrote. Matthew 6. And we're going to read a couple verses here. Matthew 6 and verse 25. Therefore I say to you, do not worry about your life, what you will eat or what you will drink, nor about your body, what you will put on, and not life. But is not life more than food or body or clothing? And down to verse 27. Which of you by worrying can add 1 cubit to his stature? And let's jump down to 33. But seek ye first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and all these things shall be added to you. Therefore, do not worry about tomorrow, for today will worry about its own things. Not you, but worry about its own things. Sufficient for the day is its own trouble. Now, I always like stories, and there's a perfect example of a couple individuals who did just that. And it's one of my favorite stories of all. And let's go to Daniel. We all know it, but it's always good just to look at it again. But we're going to go to Daniel 3. Daniel 3. Come on, Hosea. There, Daniel. Daniel 3, and we know the story. That's when Nebuchadnezzar made them bow down. And in verse 14, Nebuchadnezzar spoke to them, saying, Is it true, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you do not serve my gods or worship the golden image which I have set up? And in verse 16, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego answered and said to the king, O Nebuchadnezzar, we have no need to answer you in this matter. If that is the case, our God, whom we serve, is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace, and he will deliver us from your hand, O king. They were confident in his faith. But to me, the thing that is absolutely mind-blowing to me is verse 18. But if not, let it be known to you, O king, that we do not serve your gods, nor will we shall worship the golden image which you have set up. Wow. They did not know what was around the corner. Were they going to live? Were they going to die? Who knew? Who knew? But of course we know the answer to that story. They got thrown into the fiery furnace, and not even when they were pulled out, they didn't even smell of fire or smoke. Now, the second lesson that I learned. God has a view of the bigger picture. I don't. Now, frequently we'll hear people ask the question, why does God let bad things happen to good people? Do you know what? That question when you ask that question, you are demonstrating to the whole world that you really don't trust God. Sorry, that's just the way. Sorry, I know you're supposed to say, it's not the way I see it, it's the way God sees it. But you know what? It's not on recognizing the fact that God has the big plan. We don't. But, and the funny thing is, we're pretty close to this, so let's go to the book of Habakkuk. book of Habakkuk. Come on, it's just before Zephaniah. So just go find Zephaniah, and it's before that. But if you read through the book of Habakkuk, do you know the funny thing about this whole book? Habakkuk is about the prophet Habakkuk asking God that exact question. That's exactly what this whole book is about. Why? What are you doing, God? And then let's go down to Habakkuk 2. And he just in the end of verse 1, in verse 1 and the end of chapter 1, Habakkuk says, pretty much, I'm paraphrasing, God, what are you doing? And then in chapter 2, verse 2, then the Lord answered me and said, write the vision and make it plain on tablets, that we may run who reads it. Verse 3, for the vision is yet to be an appointed time, but at the end it will speak, and it will not lie. Though it tarries, wait for it, because it will surely come. It will not tarry. Behold the proud. His soul is not upright in him. And this is the famous one. This is what God tells Habakkuk when he asks that exact question. But the just shall live by faith. And what he's basically saying is, Habakkuk, don't worry about it. I got the big picture. Don't worry about it. I had a close friend, by the way. I have a close friend right now who has a big cancerous mass on his left lung. Good Baptist. I mean, he really is. He's a good Christian man. But he and I were talking the one time, and he says, you know, we can juggle 1 to 2 balls at a time. He says, don't you think it would be best for us to trust the individual who can juggle all the balls at one time? And does he drop any of them? No. So who should you trust? The man who has the big picture or not? Or us? You know, let me read a quick story on this one, too, before we move on to the next point. Genesis 22, another very famous story. Genesis 22, that's Abraham and Isaac when he was sacrificing Isaac. But there's just a couple verses I'd like to read in here. Genesis 22 and verse 2. Then he, God, said, take you now your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah and offer him as a burnt offering on one of the mountains which I shall tell you. And in verse 3, Abraham did. And Abraham said to the lad, in verse 5, verse 6. So Abraham took the wood of the burnt offering and laid it on Isaac. Okay, let me back up. My eyes not catching. Oh, sorry. Yeah, Isaac offers, by the way. And Abraham took the young man. And anyway, my eyes not catching it. I apologize on that. It's right in here. But Isaac asks, where is the offering? Where's the sacrifice? And Abraham responds, does anybody see that verse? Verse 7? Oh yeah, here we go. In verse 7. Thank you, Ryan. But Isaac spoke to Abraham his father and said, my father. And he said, here I am, my son. Then he said, look, the fire and the wood. But where is the lamb for a burnt offering? And Abraham said, my son, God will provide himself the lamb for a burnt offering. Did Abraham have the big picture? No. Do you know what the big picture was in this one? There were lots of big pictures associated with this one. But he was ready to slay him. And in verse 11, the angel of the Lord called to him from heaven, saying, Abraham, Abraham. And so he said, here I am. And he said, do not lay your hand on the lad or do anything to him, for now I know that you fear God, since you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me. So there were lots of big pictures and lots of analogies associated with it, but what was the near term? The near term was God was testing Abraham. Did Abraham understand this big picture? No, he did not. So when we have a trial, do we see the big picture? Probably not. Do we see what God's doing in our lives? Do I have a trouble seeing what God's doing in my life? You bet you. And another one, the third lesson, and I have a lot more lessons, but for the third lesson, faith produces peace, because I understood that God has my back, that God is in control of every situation. Like I said before, when this trial first cropped up, my mind was a whirl. I mean, it just kept moving. There were nights that I would just sit up. I would lay in bed and I couldn't go to sleep. So I'd just get up because I knew I was tossing and turning, waking up Tracy. So I'd get up and I'd watch TV because it was just kind of shutting the mind off. But and I would sit up till 2, 3, 4 in the morning because it just couldn't stop. But you know what? When I came to this realization, I could sleep. Now here's a couple verses I'd like to read you. I printed it in gray. But anyway, let's go to Psalm 27, please. Actually, you know what? Let me take that back. Let's go to, Psalm 27 is a good one too, but let's go to Psalm 56, please. Psalm 56, and in verse 3. Whenever I'm afraid, I will trust you. In God I will praise his word, and in God I have put my trust. I will not fear what flesh can do to me. And down in verse 9, when I cry out to you, then my enemies will turn back. This I know because God is for me. Doesn't that sound familiar, by the way? Romans 8. And continuing on, verse 10, and in God I will praise his word. In the Lord I will praise his word. In God I will put my trust. I will not be afraid. What can men do to me? And please, let's turn over to Psalm 131. And by the way, all these really helped me. I mean, I cannot begin to tell you. But Psalm 131 and in verse 1. Lord, my heart is not haughty, nor my eyes lofty. Neither do I concern myself with great matters, nor with things too proud for me. Surely I have calmed and quieted my soul like a weaned child with his mother. Like a weaned child is my soul within me. O Israel, hope in the Lord, for this time forevermore. So what did I ultimately learn? I ultimately learned a couple things. Actually, one major thing. I'm not in charge. That sounds kind of funny to say, but no, I'm not in charge. And it was kind of a hard thing. All my efforts don't amount to a hill of beans. So, I found out, and I learned for me personally, when my mind is racing with thoughts and I can't sleep, when I'm angry, when I'm frustrated, when I'll even say when I'm angry at people, when I'm not content with my life, do you know what I feel like? I feel like I'm out of control. And the realization that I came to is that I'm not in control. It's God that is control. So let me close on one more verse too. And let's go back a couple pages more to Psalm 112. And we'll end here. Psalm 112, and we'll start with verse 5. A good man deals graciously and lends. He will guide his affairs with discretion. Surely he will never be shaken. The righteous will be in everlasting remembrance. He will not be afraid of evil tidings. His heart is steadfast, trusting in the Lord. his heart is established. He will not be afraid until he sees desire upon his enemy.